Marcus Chen had made this same subway ride for 12 years, briefcase in hand, mind already at home with his wife and daughter. In the evening rush, when identical black cases crowd the train car like a convention of accountants, one small mistake can change everything. He grabbed what he thought was his briefcase as the doors slid shut at his stop. At home, when he clicked open the latches expecting quarterly reports and expense receipts, stacks of $100 bills stared back at him. Beneath the money lay documents bearing names he recognized from newspaper headlines, addresses of warehouses that didn't officially exist, and photographs of men whose faces appeared in FBI wanted posters. The briefcase belonged to the Torrino family, and they wanted it back. But when you accidentally steal from the most powerful crime family in the city, how do you return what was never meant to be yours? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus Chen lived the kind of life that filled suburban coffee shops and office buildings across America. Every morning at 6:47 a.m., his alarm would pull him from dreams of balanced spreadsheets and paid-off mortgages. By 7:15, he'd be dressed in one of his 4 nearly identical gray suits, kissing his wife Sarah goodbye as she prepared breakfast for their 8-year-old daughter Emma. The house on Maple Street represented everything Marcus had worked towards since graduating. With his accounting degree 15 years ago, 3 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, a small yard where Emma could play safely behind a white picket fence that needed painting every other spring. The mortgage payments stretched their budget thin, but Marcus took pride in never missing one, never being late with the electric bill or the car insurance. On his desk at Hartwell & Associates, a silver-frame photograph captured his world perfectly. Sarah and Emma at last summer's company picnic, both wearing matching sundresses that Sarah had sewn herself to save money. Emma's gap-toothed grin filled the center of the frame, her arms wrapped around Sarah's neck with the unconscious affection that children show before they learn to be embarrassed by parental love. Marcus specialized in small business accounts, the kind of clients who brought shoeboxes full of receipts and apologized for their disorganization. He found satisfaction in creating order from chaos, turning crumpled papers and hastily scribbled notes into clean financial statements that told the story of someone's livelihood. Mrs. Patterson's flower shop, Rodriguez Construction, Thompson's Auto Repair. Each business represented a family's dreams and struggles, much like his own. The work paid reasonably well, enough to maintain their modest lifestyle and contribute small amounts to Emma's college fund. Marcus had calculated that if he received his expected raises and Emma qualified for some scholarships, they could manage her education without crushing debt. These calculations filled the notebooks he kept at home, pages of careful arithmetic that mapped their financial future year by year. Sarah taught piano lessons 3 afternoons a week, her students ranging from enthusiastic 6-year-olds who pounded out chopsticks to teenagers whose parents insisted music would help with college applications. Her income covered extras like Emma's soccer cleats and the occasional dinner out, small luxuries that made their careful budgeting worthwhile. Evenings followed predictable rhythms that Marcus treasured. Dinner together at the kitchen table, no phones or television to interrupt conversation about Emma's school day or Sarah's students. Homework supervision while Sarah cleaned up, then family time in the living room, where they'd read together or work on jigsaw puzzles that gradually consumed the coffee table over several weeks. Bedtime stories were Marcus's specialty. Elaborate adventures featuring a brave princess named Emma who solved problems through cleverness rather than magic. These tales grew more complex as Emma aged, incorporating real-world challenges like friendship difficulties or fears about growing up. Through Princess Emma's adventures, Marcus could address his daughter's concerns while maintaining the comforting distance that fiction provides. Weekends brought yard work and household projects, the endless maintenance that home ownership requires. Marcus had learned basic plumbing and electrical work through necessity and YouTube videos, pride mixing with frustration as he tackled repairs that would have been expensive to hire out. Sarah maintained their vegetable garden, a small patch behind the garage that produced enough tomatoes and peppers to noticeably reduce their grocery bills. The briefcase had been a Christmas gift from Sarah 5 years ago. Practical black leather that matched every suit Marcus owned. She'd had his initials embossed in gold letters near the handle, a touch of personalization that made the utilitarian object feel special. Inside, he carried the portable office of modern professional life, laptop computer, financial calculators, client files, the Mont Blanc pen that had belonged to his father. This Tuesday had begun like hundreds of others. Marcus reviewing quarterly reports for 3 small businesses while eating the sandwich Sarah had packed for his lunch. The work required concentration, but not creativity, number checking and form filing that left his mind free to wander toward evening plans. Emma had a soccer game at 6 o'clock, her first as starting midfielder for the Wildcat Warriors. The subway ride home should have been routine, 37 minutes from downtown to suburban tranquility. Marcus usually spent the time reading industry publications or reviewing tomorrow's schedule. Briefcase balanced on his knees, while the train carried him away from spreadsheets toward family dinner and homework help. Such ordinary moments, he would later realize, represent the entire architecture of contentment. Small routines and modest ambitions, carefully maintained relationships, and slowly accumulated security. Everything worth protecting, everything that could be lost through one moment of inattention in a crowded subway car. The briefcase felt heavier than usual as Marcus climbed the front steps to his house, though he attributed the weight to fatigue from a long day of reconciling accounts that refused to balance. Sarah's car sat in the driveway, meaning she'd returned from her Tuesday piano lessons with the Morrison twins, who showed remarkable talent for playing different songs simultaneously. "Daddy's home," Emma's voice carried from the kitchen, where the smell of Sarah's famous lasagna filled the air with garlic and oregano. Normal family sounds, the clink of dishes being set on the table, Sarah humming something classical while she cooked, the television murmuring evening news from the living room. Marcus set the briefcase beside his usual chair at the kitchen table, kissing Sarah's cheek as she pulled dinner from the oven. "How are the Morrison twins today?" "Improving slowly. Rebecca can almost play scales without looking at her hands, and Robert only tried to play chopsticks during Rebecca's lesson twice." Sarah's smile carried the patient affection of someone who genuinely enjoyed teaching children, even challenging ones. Dinner conversation revolved around Emma's upcoming science project on butterflies and Sarah's plans to attend a piano recital featuring one of her adult students. Marcus contributed appropriately, asking questions and offering suggestions, while his mind drifted toward the quarterly reports he needed to review before tomorrow's client meeting. After Emma finished her homework and settled into bed with a new chapter book about dragons, Marcus finally opened his briefcase at the kitchen table. Sarah was loading the dishwasher, her back turned as she organized plates and glasses with the same methodical approach she brought to everything. The latches clicked open with their familiar sound, but instead of manila folders and financial calculators, stacks of cash filled the interior compartments. $100 bills, crisp and new, bound with rubber bands in neat packets. Marcus stared at the money, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Sarah. His voice came out strangled, barely audible above the dishwasher's quiet hum. She turned, dish towel in hand, and saw his expression. "Marcus, what's wrong?" He gestured helplessly at the briefcase. Sarah approached slowly, her eyes widening as she took in the cash. "Oh my God, how much is there?" Marcus's accounting training kicked in automatically. He began counting, his hands shaking slightly as he handled more cash than he'd ever seen in one place. 50 packets, each containing 100 bills. $5 million, sitting on their kitchen table like some impossible lottery prize. Beneath the money, Marcus found documents that made his blood pressure spike. Financial records bearing the letterhead of businesses he recognized. transactions that moved money through complex networks of shell companies and overseas accounts. Names he'd seen in newspaper crime stories appeared throughout the papers. Vincent Castellano, Anthony Torrino, Michael Santos. That organizational chart detailed the hierarchy of what appeared to be a criminal enterprise. Don Salvatore Torrino occupied the top position, with various lieutenants and soldiers arranged in careful ranks below him. Phone numbers, addresses, and coded notations filled the margins, creating a comprehensive map of illegal operations. Sarah picked up a photograph that had been tucked beneath the organizational chart. It showed several men in expensive suits standing outside a restaurant Marcus recognized from downtown. Vincent Castellano dominated the center of the image, his face unmistakable from FBI-wanted posters that occasionally appeared on evening news broadcasts. "Marcus, this isn't your briefcase." The statement hung in the air like smoke from a fire they couldn't yet see. Marcus examined the case more carefully, noting details he'd missed in his shock. The leather was slightly different in texture, the stitching around the handle more pronounced. His initials were missing from the usual spot near the clasps. "The subway," Marcus whispered. "There were so many briefcases. When the train stopped at my station, everyone was grabbing bags. I must have taken the wrong one." Sarah sat down heavily in her chair, still holding the photograph. "Whose briefcase is this? Who loses $5 million and doesn't notice?" Marcus found partial answers in the remaining documents. Business cards for legitimate-seeming companies that appeared to be fronts for money laundering operations. Bank account numbers from institutions in countries that didn't cooperate with American law enforcement. Lists of judges, police officers, and politicians with dollar amounts beside their names. One document made Marcus's stomach clench with recognition. A detailed financial report for Hartwell and Associates, his own accounting firm, showed patterns of transactions that had nothing to do with their actual business. Money flowing through client accounts in amounts that far exceeded the legitimate income of small businesses Marcus knew intimately. His employer was part of this. The company where he'd worked for 8 years, the professional home where he'd built his reputation and earned the trust of clients who depended on his honesty, was facilitating massive money laundering operations. "We have to call the police," Sarah said. Though her voice carried no conviction, Marcus continued studying the documents, his trained eye recognizing the sophisticated nature of the financial crimes outlined in meticulous detail. This wasn't simple theft or drug dealing. This was organized crime operating at the highest levels, with connections that reached into law enforcement, government, and legitimate business. A business card fell from between two financial reports. Vincent Castellano, Import-Export Consulting. The phone number had been circled in red ink, with a note written in careful handwriting, "Primary contact for all inquiries." Marcus realized with growing horror that someone, somewhere, was probably looking for this briefcase with increasing desperation. $5 million in cash, combined with documents that could destroy an entire criminal organization, represented the kind of loss that prompted violent responses from people who viewed murder as a business expense. The kitchen clock showed 9:47 p.m. Emma was safely asleep upstairs. Sarah was sitting across from him, processing the same terrible implications he was reaching. And somewhere in the city, very dangerous people were discovering that their most sensitive secrets had disappeared into the subway system during evening rush hour. Marcus barely slept that night, staring at the ceiling while Sarah tossed restlessly beside him. Every car that passed their quiet street seemed to slow down. Every distant sound might be footsteps on their front porch. He'd hidden the briefcase in their bedroom closet, behind winter coats that wouldn't be needed for months, as if putting it out of sight could somehow undo the terrible mistake. Morning brought no relief. Marcus dressed for work mechanically, his mind cycling through impossible scenarios. Return the briefcase anonymously, Mail it to the police? Pretend it never happened, and hope whoever lost it would assume it fell into the wrong hands by accident rather than theft. Sarah made coffee with shaking hands, her usual morning efficiency replaced by the jerky movements of someone operating on pure nervous energy. What are we going to do, Marcus? I don't know. I need to think. Emma bounced into the kitchen wearing her soccer uniform, chattering about today's practice and the new cleats Sarah had bought her over the weekend. Her innocent enthusiasm felt surreal against the backdrop of their terror. Normal childhood concerns existing in a different universe from the one Marcus now inhabited. He kissed Emma goodbye at the usual time, watching through the front window as she boarded the school bus with her typical 8-year-old energy. The routine felt precious and fragile, a reminder of everything that mattered more than money or secrets hidden in briefcases. The black sedan appeared as Marcus backed out of his driveway. Dark windows, expensive chrome, the kind of car that screamed wealth and power rather than family transportation. It followed him to the train station, maintaining careful distance but making no attempt to hide its presence. At work, Marcus couldn't concentrate on the Rodriguez construction account that needed his attention. Numbers blurred together on his computer screen while he researched the Torrino family online, learning details that made his situation feel increasingly hopeless. Salvatore Torrino had controlled organized crime in the region for 30 years, surviving FBI investigations, rival family challenges, and the kind of legal troubles that destroyed lesser criminals. His organization was known for two things: sophisticated financial operations that generated hundreds of millions in revenue, and swift, permanent responses to anyone who threatened their business. Vincent Castellano, identified in news articles as Torrino's primary lieutenant, had been arrested 17 times but never convicted of anything more serious than tax evasion. Witnesses had a tendency to disappear or recant their testimony. Police evidence somehow became inadmissible due to technical violations. Prosecutors found their cases falling apart just before trial. Marcus's phone rang at 2:47 p.m. Unknown number. Local area code, Marcus Chen. His voice sounded steadier than he felt. Mr. Chen, you have something that belongs to me. The voice was calm, conversational, with the kind of confidence that comes from never having to repeat requests. I believe there was some confusion yesterday evening on the subway. Marcus's mouth went dry. I'm sorry, I think you have the wrong number. Black leather briefcase, combination locks, small scratch on the bottom right corner where it was dropped last month. Your initials aren't on it, Mr. Chen, which should have been your first clue. The detailed description eliminated any possibility of bluffing or denial. Marcus closed his office door, praying his voice wouldn't carry to his colleagues in the adjacent cubicles. I was planning to return it. I just didn't know how to contact the owner. How considerate. My name is Vincent Castellano, and I'm very interested in recovering my property. More importantly, I'm interested in ensuring that certain documents remain private. Marcus had expected threats, angry demands, immediate violence. Instead, Vincent's tone remained businesslike, almost friendly. The restraint felt more frightening than screaming would have been. I understand completely, Mr. Castellano. This was an honest mistake. I'm sure it was. Mistakes happen, Mr. Chen. The important thing is correcting them quickly and completely. Are you familiar with the concept of confidentiality? Yes, excellent. Then you understand that some business matters require discretion. I'm prepared to be generous in exchange for your cooperation and silence. Marcus found a burner phone on his desk when he returned from lunch, placed precisely beside his computer keyboard like an appointment he'd forgotten. Black plastic, cheap design. The kind of device sold in convenience stores for cash transactions. A small white sticker on the back bore a phone number written in careful block letters. His hands trembled as he powered on the device. One text message waited in the inbox. Call tonight at 9 p.m. Come alone to Riverside Park, main entrance. Bring my briefcase. We'll discuss the terms of our arrangement. Marcus stared at the message until the letters blurred together. Terms of arrangement, as if he had any negotiating power in this situation. any choice except complete compliance with whatever Vincent Castellano demanded. The black sedan was waiting in the parking garage when Marcus left work early, claiming a sudden headache that wasn't entirely fictional. It followed him home again, maintaining the same careful distance, its presence a constant reminder that his family's safety now depended on the goodwill of people who settled disputes with violence. Sarah was waiting in the kitchen, her face pale with worry that had clearly been building throughout the day. Emma's soccer practice was cancelled. Coach Morrison said there were suspicious men asking questions about the team, about which parents came to games regularly. Marcus felt the walls of his normal life collapsing inward. The Torrino family wasn't just watching him. They were mapping his entire world, identifying every person and place that mattered to him. Emma's school, Sarah's piano students, the quiet neighborhood where they'd built their careful, modest dreams. "They want to meet tonight," Marcus said, showing Sarah the burner phone. "Riverside Park, 9 o'clock. Sarah read the message twice, her teacher's instincts translating the polite language into its underlying threat. "What if you don't go?" Marcus looked out the kitchen window toward the street, where the black sedan sat under a streetlight like a predator waiting for darkness. "I don't think that's an option." The briefcase waited in their bedroom closet, $5 million and enough criminal evidence to destroy lives. Less than 24 hours ago, Marcus's biggest worry had been Emma's college fund and whether they could afford to replace the washing machine before. It died completely. Now he was preparing to meet with a man whose business card probably represented more danger than Marcus had faced in his entire previous life combined. Marcus spent the afternoon at the downtown library, using public computers to research the Torrino family with the thoroughness he usually reserved for tax audits. What he discovered made his stomach clench with each new article, each FBI report that painted a picture of an organization that had perfected violence as a business strategy. The Torrino family had operated in the region since the 1950s, when Salvatore's father had arrived from Sicily with connections to established crime families and ambitions that extended far beyond traditional neighborhood rackets. They'd evolved with the times, moving from street-level operations into sophisticated financial crimes that generated revenue, streams most legitimate corporations would envy. Vincent Castellano's name appeared in dozens of news stories spanning 15 years. Federal investigations that mysteriously lost key evidence, witnesses who changed their testimony or disappeared entirely before trials could begin, prosecutors who found their cases falling, apart due to procedural technicalities that seemed to multiply whenever Torrino family members faced serious charges. Marcus printed articles that detailed the family's suspected involvement in everything, from money laundering to contract killing, though convictions remained elusive. The pattern was clear. The Torrino organization had infiltrated law enforcement at multiple levels, buying protection from people who were supposed to protect the public. One article from 3 years ago caught Marcus's attention. Detective Ray Morrison of the Major Crimes Unit had been quoted extensively about the challenges of building cases against organized crime families. "They've corrupted the system from the inside," Morrison had said. "When evidence disappears from police lockers and witnesses receive death threats from people who know their home addresses, it becomes nearly impossible to pursue justice through normal channels." Marcus memorized Morrison's name and precinct, sensing that he might represent the only honest law enforcement contact available. If corruption was as extensive as the article suggested, approaching the wrong police officer could be a fatal mistake. The library's closing announcement at 8 p.m. forced Marcus to gather his research and face the reality of his 9 p.m. appointment. He'd spent hours learning about the Torrino family's methods, but none of that knowledge provided a clear path to safety for his family. Marcus drove to Riverside Park with the briefcase on his passenger seat, its weight seeming to increase with each mile. The park after dark attracted joggers and dog walkers during warmer months, but October's chill had emptied the paths of everyone except people who had reasons to avoid more public meeting places. Vincent Castellano waited beside the main entrance, his expensive overcoat and polished shoes marking him as someone who didn't belong in a municipal park after business hours. Two other men flanked him at respectful distances, their posture suggesting military or security backgrounds rather than street thugs. Mr. Chen, punctual as expected from an accountant. Vincent's greeting carried the same conversational tone from their phone call, as if they were meeting to discuss legitimate business rather than stolen criminal evidence. Marcus approached slowly, the briefcase handle cutting into his palm despite the cool evening air. "Mr. Castellano, I believe this belongs to you." "Indeed it does." Vincent made no immediate move to take the case. "But first we should discuss the terms of our arrangement. You've had nearly 24 hours to examine the contents, which means you understand the sensitive nature of those documents." Marcus had prepared for this moment during his research, knowing that Vincent would assume he'd studied everything in detail. "I understand that confidentiality is important in your business." "Confidentiality is everything in my business, Mr. Chen. Lives depend on information remaining private. Families depend on certain arrangements staying between the appropriate parties." The implied threat was clear without being explicit. Vincent was establishing that Marcus now possessed information that could destroy people, and that such knowledge came with permanent obligations. "I'm not interested in causing problems for anyone," Marcus said. "I just want to return your property and forget this ever happened." Vincent smiled, the expression somehow more unsettling than anger would have been. "I appreciate your discretion, Mr. Chen. However, forgetting isn't always possible. Some knowledge, once acquired, becomes a permanent responsibility." One of Vincent's associates stepped forward, revealing the police badge clipped to his belt beneath his jacket. "Detective badge," Marcus realized with growing horror. The corruption extended exactly as far as the newspaper articles had suggested. "Detective Paulson, Major Crimes Unit," the man introduced himself. "We've been monitoring your activities since yesterday evening, Mr. Chen. Internet searches, library visits, phone calls. You've been very thorough in your research." Marcus felt his carefully constructed plan collapsing. If corrupt police officers were tracking his movements, then approaching Detective Morrison or any other law enforcement contact could be walking into a trap. "Mr. Chen seems concerned," Vincent observed. "Perhaps he's beginning to understand that his situation is more complex than a simple case of mistaken briefcases." Detective Paulson consulted a small notebook. "Marcus Chen, age 34, married to Sarah Chen, father to Emma Chen, age 8. Employed at Hartwell & Associates, specializing in small business accounting. Mortgage of $247,000 on 1247 Maple Street. Car payments, the usual middle-class obligations." The recitation of personal details felt like physical blows. These people had investigated his entire life in less than 24 hours, mapping every vulnerability and pressure point that could be used against him. "Your employer has been very cooperative with our business arrangements," Vincent continued. "Mr. Hartwell understands the benefits of discreet financial services for clients who value privacy. Perhaps you could learn to appreciate similar arrangements." Marcus realized that returning the briefcase wouldn't end his involvement with the Torrino family. They intended to use his position at the accounting firm, his legitimate credentials and clean reputation to expand their money laundering operations. The briefcase had been bait and he'd taken it completely. "What exactly are you proposing?" Marcus asked, though he dreaded the answer. Vincent gestured toward a park bench where they could sit like businessmen discussing a routine transaction. "Employment, Mr. Chen. Consulting work that would supplement your current income substantially. Your expertise with financial records could be very valuable to the right clients." The offer came with the weight of absolute certainty. Marcus understood that refusing wasn't an option. that his family's safety now depended on his willingness to become part of the criminal organization that had already infiltrated his workplace. Detective Paulson handed Marcus a business card with contact information that looked completely legitimate. We'll be in touch soon with specific assignments. In the meantime, consider this a probationary period. Prove your reliability, and your family will remain safe. Disappoint us, and well. He left the sentence unfinished. Marcus took the briefcase and walked back to his car, knowing that he'd just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The Torrino family now owned him as completely as they owned Detective Paulson and apparently his employer, Mr. Hartwell. The drive home took him past normal suburban houses, where normal families were probably watching television or helping children with homework, living the kind of life Marcus had taken for granted just 2 days ago. Marcus returned home from the park meeting to find Sarah waiting in the living room, her face etched with the kind of worry that comes from imagining worst-case scenarios for 2 hours. Emma was asleep upstairs, blissfully unaware that her father had just agreed to work for the most dangerous criminal organization in the state. What happened? Sarah's voice carried the controlled tension of someone trying not to wake a sleeping child while desperate for answers. Marcus sat beside her on the couch they'd bought together 5 years ago, back when their biggest decision was whether to splurge on the extended warranty. Now he had to explain why that simple life was over, why their carefully built security had disappeared in a single moment of inattention on a subway platform. They want me to work for them. Financial consulting for their business operations. Marcus couldn't bring himself to use words like money laundering or criminal conspiracy, as if softer language might make the reality less terrible. Sarah's hand found his, her fingers cold, despite the warm house. Can we refuse? Can we go to the police? Some of the police work for them. The detective who was with Vincent tonight, he knew everything about us. Our mortgage amount, Emma's school, your piano students. They've been watching us since yesterday. The weight of their situation settled over them, like fog rolling in from the ocean, obscuring all the familiar landmarks of their normal life. Marcus pulled out his laptop and opened the encrypted files he'd copied from the briefcase before returning it, knowing that understanding their captors was the only path to eventual freedom. The USB drive contained financial records that painted a comprehensive picture of the Torrino family's operations. Money flowing through dozens of legitimate businesses, each transaction carefully structured to avoid triggering federal reporting requirements. Cash from illegal activities transformed into clean revenue through restaurants, construction companies, and import businesses that existed primarily on paper. Marcus's accounting training allowed him to trace the sophisticated patterns that less experienced investigators might miss. Funds moved through multiple accounts in precise amounts, always just below the thresholds that would attract government attention. The operation required detailed knowledge of banking regulations, tax law, and international finance. Look at this, Marcus said, pointing to a series of transactions that caught his attention. They're moving money through the same businesses that file tax returns with our office. Hartwell and Associates has been processing their paperwork for years. Sarah leaned closer to the computer screen, her teacher's instincts engaging with the problem-solving aspects of the situation. Could Mr. Hartwell not know what these businesses really do? Marcus scrolled through more files, finding documentation that answered her question definitively. Hartwell had signed off on financial statements that claimed impossible revenues for businesses with minimal legitimate operations. A restaurant that supposedly served 300 customers daily but had no delivery service and only 20 parking spaces. A construction company that reported massive profits while owning no heavy equipment. He knows, Marcus said. These numbers don't make sense unless you understand what's really happening. No legitimate accountant would file returns like this without asking questions. The discovery that his employer was fully complicit in the criminal operations made Marcus feel even more trapped. Hartwell and Associates wasn't just a workplace anymore. It was a criminal enterprise disguised as a respectable accounting firm, and Marcus was now an unwilling participant in federal crimes. One file contained photographs that made Marcus's blood pressure spike. Images of federal judges, police commanders, and city council members meeting with Vincent Castellano in locations that suggested social rather than professional relationships. Birthday parties, wedding receptions, private dinners where public officials socialized with known criminals as if they were legitimate. Businessmen dot a spreadsheet labeled monthly. Arrangements listed names and payment amounts that corresponded to the people in the photographs. Judge Harrison, $15,000. Police Captain Rodriguez, $8,000. City Councilman Walsh, $12,000. The corruption reached into every level of local government, creating a network that could protect the Torrino family from almost any legal challenge. Sarah pointed to another file that contained detailed surveillance reports on federal investigators. FBI agents assigned to organize crime cases had been photographed, their home addresses documented, their family members identified. The Torrino organization knew exactly who was investigating them and possessed enough personal information to threaten anyone who got too close to dangerous evidence. "They're not just criminals," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They've taken over the entire system." Marcus found the most disturbing files buried in encrypted folders that required additional passwords to access. Murder contracts disguised as business memos, with targets identified by code names and elimination methods discussed in corporate language. Project Thompson requires permanent resolution. The Williams situation needs final closure. Each euphemistic phrase represented someone who had threatened the Torrino organization's interests and paid the ultimate price. Witnesses who had agreed to testify, journalists who had investigated too thoroughly, rival criminals who had encroached on established territory. The family maintained detailed records of these operations, like any business tracking completed projects. One file made Marcus's hands shake as he read it. A surveillance report on Detective Ray Morrison, the honest cop Marcus had planned to contact for help. Morrison's home address, his wife's work schedule, his teenage daughter's school routine. The file noted that Morrison had been asking inappropriate questions about family business, operations, and recommended elevated monitoring pending resolution. Marcus realized that approaching Morrison would likely result in the detective's death and possibly his own. The Torrino family had anticipated every possible avenue of resistance and prepared countermeasures that eliminated hope before it could develop into action. The laptop's screen illuminated their living room with the blue glow of financial documents that represented thousands of crimes, millions of dollars in illegal proceeds, and dozens of lives destroyed by an organization that had perfected corruption as a business model. Marcus and Sarah sat in silence, absorbing the magnitude of what they now knew and the impossibility of using that knowledge safely. Outside, the black sedan maintained its vigil under the streetlight, a constant reminder that their every movement was being monitored by people who killed witnesses as routinely as legitimate. Businesses fired unproductive employees. The encrypted USB drive contained enough evidence to destroy the Torrino family completely, but accessing that evidence would require surviving long enough to present it to authorities who weren't already owned by the very criminals they were supposed to investigate. Marcus closed the laptop and looked at his wife. Seeing his own terror reflected in her eyes, they possessed the most dangerous information in the city, and absolutely no safe way to use it. Marcus woke the next morning to the sound of Sarah screaming in the kitchen. He bolted downstairs in his pajamas, expecting to find intruders or worse, but instead discovered his wife staring at her phone with a look of absolute terror. They were at Emma's school. Sarah's voice shook as she showed him the text message from Emma's teacher. "Mrs. Peterson says 2 men came to the office yesterday asking about our family, claiming to be from the insurance company. They had photographs of Emma Marcus. They knew which classroom she was in, what time she ate lunch, who she played with at recess. Marcus felt the last of his illusions about controlling this situation crumble away. The Torrino family wasn't just monitoring him or even threatening his family in abstract terms. They were actively stalking his 8-year-old daughter, learning her routines with the thoroughness of professionals planning an operation. The phone rang as Marcus tried to process the implications. Emma's school, calling before 7 a.m., which meant something serious had happened overnight. Mr. Chen, this is Principal Davis. I'm afraid we need to discuss some security concerns regarding Emma. Could you and your wife come in this morning before classes begin? Marcus agreed to the meeting while Sarah paced the kitchen, her maternal instincts fully engaged in a way that made compromise impossible. We have to take Emma somewhere safe, today, right now. Where, Sarah? They know where we live, where we work, where Emma goes to school. They've probably already mapped every relative and friend we have. The truth of his words settled over them like a physical weight. The Torrino family possessed resources that individual families couldn't match. Professional surveillance capabilities that eliminated most options for hiding or running. At Emma's school, Principal Davis explained the situation with the careful language of someone who had dealt with similar problems before. The men who visited yesterday had very detailed information about several of our students. Not just Emma, they claimed to be conducting routine insurance evaluations, but their questions were far too specific for legitimate business purposes. Mrs. Peterson, Emma's third-grade teacher, looked exhausted in the way that suggested she'd been up all night worrying about her students' safety. They knew Emma's schedule better than some of our substitute teachers do. What time she arrives, where she sits during lunch, which bathroom she uses during class breaks. Marcus realized that the school visit hadn't been random intimidation. The Torrino family was demonstrating their capability to reach Emma anywhere, anytime, establishing that traditional protective measures like changing schools or hiring security would be inadequate against their resources. We've implemented additional security protocols. Principal Davis continued. No one gets access to student information without proper identification and verified authorization. But Mr. Chen, I have to ask, is your family involved in some kind of legal situation that might put other children at risk? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Marcus understood that the school's primary concern was protecting all their students, which meant Emma might be excluded if her presence posed a threat to others. We're working to resolve the situation, Marcus said, the phrase feeling inadequate against the magnitude of their actual problem. On the drive home, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Marcus pulled into a parking lot to read the message, his hands shaking as he processed the words. Your daughter is beautiful when she laughs. The photograph yesterday at 2:17 p.m. during recess shows her playing on the swing set with her friend Jessica. Such a trusting child, so easy to approach when she's focused on having fun. Attached to the message was a high-resolution photograph of Emma mid-swing, her face bright with the uncomplicated joy that 8-year-olds experience during play. But the image had been taken with a telephoto lens from outside the school fence. During what should have been a completely secure environment, Sarah made a sound that was part sob, part growl of maternal fury. They're not just watching her, they're getting close enough to touch her. Marcus stared at the photograph, noting details that made his stomach clench. The timestamp showed the image had been taken yesterday afternoon. While he was meeting with Vincent in Riverside Park, the Torrino family had been threatening his daughter at the exact moment he was agreeing to work for them. The second text arrived before Marcus could fully process the first. Cooperation ensures everyone's safety. Resistance ensures regret. Your first assignment begins Monday. Report to Vincent at the warehouse address you found in our files. Marcus realized they'd been monitoring his access to the encrypted USB drive. tracking every file he'd opened and every detail he'd learned about their operations. The warehouse address was buried deep in the financial records, requiring hours of careful analysis to locate. The fact that they knew he'd found it proved their surveillance extended to electronic monitoring of his home computer. "We can't send her to school anymore," Sarah said, her teacher's practical mind engaging with the immediate logistics of protecting their daughter. "And we can't keep her home if they're watching the house this closely." Marcus thought about the honest families in their neighborhood, people like the Hendersons next door who had teenage children and normal concerns about homework and dating. The contrast between their problems and his family's new reality felt surreal, like comparing a paper cut to a severed artery. The drive home took them past Riverside Park, where Marcus had naively believed that returning the briefcase would end his involvement with the Torrino family. Now he understood that the meeting had been designed to trap him, using his concern for his family's safety to transform him from accidental witness into permanent accomplice. At home, Emma was getting ready for school with her usual 8-year-old efficiency. Backpack organized and lunch money counted twice to make sure she hadn't lost any coins. Her normalcy felt precious and fragile, a reminder of everything the Torrino family could destroy with a single phone call. "Daddy, why do you and Mommy look sad?" Emma's question carried the directness that children use when adult emotions intrude on their secure world. Marcus knelt to her level, trying to find words that would provide reassurance without lying completely. "We're just working through some grown-up problems, sweetheart. Sometimes that makes people look worried, even when everything's going to be okay." The lie tasted bitter in his mouth, but protecting Emma's sense of security seemed more important than absolute honesty. She would learn soon enough that the world contained dangers that loving parents couldn't always prevent. Sarah announced that Emma would be staying home from school for a few days, claiming a mild illness that required monitoring. Emma accepted the explanation with the trust that children show toward parents who have never lied to them about important things. As Marcus prepared to leave for work, knowing that Monday would bring his first assignment as an unwilling criminal, Sarah handed him the photograph of Emma on the swing set. "Don't let them win," she said, her voice carrying the fierce determination of someone prepared to fight for her child's safety, regardless of the odds. Monday morning arrived with the kind of gray October sky that made every shadow seem darker and every sound more ominous. Marcus dressed for work in his usual gray suit, but the routine felt like putting on a costume for a role he'd never auditioned to play. Today he would officially become a criminal, using his accounting skills to help the Torrino family legitimize money stolen through violence and intimidation. Sarah had barely slept, spending the weekend researching security systems and escape routes with the desperate efficiency of someone trying to solve an impossible problem. Emma remained home, supposedly recovering from a mild flu that conveniently coincided with the need to keep her away from school until better protection could be arranged. At Hartwell and Associates, Marcus discovered that his office had been subtly reorganized during the weekend. His computer had been upgraded, his filing cabinets replaced with newer models that featured different lock mechanisms. A small camera, barely visible in the corner near the ceiling, had been installed with the kind of professional discretion that suggested surveillance specialists rather than office maintenance. Mr. Hartwell appeared in Marcus's doorway at exactly 9 a.m., his expression carrying the forced cheerfulness of someone delivering bad news disguised as opportunity. "Marcus, I hope you had a restful weekend. We have some exciting new client accounts that will require your particular expertise with complex financial arrangements." The euphemistic language couldn't disguise the reality that Marcus was being formally inducted into the money laundering operation that had apparently been operating through his workplace for years. Hartwell's nervous smile suggested he understood exactly how unwilling Marcus was to participate. Vincent Castellano will be joining us this morning to discuss the specific requirements. Hartwell continued. I know you'll find working with his organization to be professionally rewarding. Vincent arrived at 10:30, dressed in an expensive suit that made him look like a legitimate businessman, rather than someone who ordered murders as casually as other people's scheduled meetings. He carried a leather portfolio and moved with the confident ease of someone conducting routine business in familiar territory. Mr. Chen, punctual as always. I appreciate professionals who understand the value of reliability. Vincent settled into the chair across from Marcus's desk with the comfortable familiarity of someone who had conducted similar meetings many times before. His presence transformed the office from Marcus's workplace into Vincent's territory, a reminder that the Torrino family's influence extended into every aspect of Marcus's professional life. Your employer speaks very highly of your analytical skills and attention to detail, qualities that are essential when handling sensitive financial matters. Vincent opened his portfolio and withdrew several documents that looked like legitimate business contracts, company names that Marcus didn't recognize, financial arrangements that required careful structuring to appear legal while serving illegal purposes. These organizations generate substantial revenue through various enterprises. Import businesses, construction companies, restaurants that serve a very exclusive clientele. Your job is to ensure their financial records meet all regulatory requirements while maintaining appropriate privacy. Marcus examined the contracts, his trained eye immediately recognizing the patterns that indicated money laundering operations. Revenue figures that bore no relationship to the business's actual activities. Expense categories that existed only to justify cash flow. Accounting methods designed to confuse rather than clarify. Mr. Castellano, these numbers don't reflect normal business operations. Vincent's smile carried the patient condescension of someone explaining obvious facts to a slow student. Mr. Chen, normal is a relative concept. These businesses operate in specialized markets that require unconventional approaches to traditional accounting practices. The careful language couldn't disguise what Vincent was asking Marcus to do. Create false financial statements, file fraudulent tax returns, structure transactions specifically to avoid federal reporting requirements. Crimes that carried decades in federal prison for accountants who participated knowingly. Vincent withdrew a small velvet box from his portfolio, placing it on Marcus's desk with ceremonial precision. Inside, a gold signet ring bore the Torrino family crest, an ornate design that represented generations of criminal tradition. This ring belonged to my uncle Anthony, who served the family for 40 years before retiring to a very comfortable life in Florida. Loyalty to the Torrino organization has always been rewarded generously. The ring felt heavier than its size suggested, weighted with implications that Marcus understood completely. Wearing it would mark him as a formal member of the criminal organization, subject to their protection and their rules in equal measure. Of course, disloyalty has consequences that are equally consistent, Vincent continued, his tone remaining conversational despite the obvious threat. But I don't anticipate any problems with someone as intelligent as you, Mr. Chen. Marcus studied the ring, noting the craftsmanship that suggested significant value beyond its symbolic meaning. Anthony Torrino's 40-year career had apparently ended successfully, which meant cooperation was possible even for people who hadn't chosen their involvement voluntarily. What exactly would my responsibilities include? Vincent consulted a leather-bound notebook that contained what appeared to be detailed organizational charts. Financial consulting for approximately 24 businesses. Tax preparation, regulatory compliance, investment advice. Standard accounting services for clients who value discretion. The job description sounded almost legitimate until Marcus considered the clients Vincent represented. Businesses that existed primarily on paper. Investment strategies that focused on laundering illegal proceeds. Regulatory compliance that meant avoiding federal investigation rather than following actual laws. Your compensation would be substantial, Vincent added, withdrawing a bank statement from his portfolio. $100,000 annually, deposited monthly into an account established specifically for your consulting fees. Additionally, your family's security would be permanently guaranteed by the Torrino organization. The money represented more than Marcus earned from his legitimate accounting work, enough to pay off their mortgage and establish the college fund for Emma that had seemed impossible on his current salary. But the payment came with obligations that extended far beyond professional services. "I'll need some time to consider your offer," Marcus said. Though both men understood that refusal wasn't actually an option, Vincent closed his portfolio with the satisfied air of someone completing a successful negotiation. "Of course, take all the time you need, Mr. Chen, but I should mention that our current accountant is retiring at the end of this week, which means we'll need your decision quite soon." The implied deadline eliminated any possibility of lengthy deliberation. Marcus had until Friday to accept Vincent's proposition or face the consequences that had been demonstrated through surveillance of his daughter and threats to his family's safety. After Vincent left, Marcus sat alone in his office, staring at the Torrino family ring that represented his formal induction into organized crime. The gold caught the fluorescent lighting, reflecting brightness that seemed to mock the darkness of his situation. Outside his window, the city continued its normal rhythms of commerce and daily life, people pursuing honest careers and legal goals while Marcus prepared to become part of the criminal underground that operated parallel to legitimate society. The ring waited on his desk like a choice that had already been made for him. Marcus left work early that Monday, claiming a sudden migraine that wasn't entirely fictional. The weight of Vincent's proposition sat in his stomach like spoiled food, the Torrino family ring burning in his jacket pocket where he'd hidden it from his colleagues' curious glances. He needed to think to find some option that didn't involve becoming a permanent criminal or watching his family disappear. The coffee shop 3 blocks from his office provided the kind of anonymous environment where suburban accountants could sit unnoticed among college students and freelance writers. Marcus ordered black coffee he didn't want and found a corner table where he could observe the entrance while trying to process the impossible choice Vincent had presented. Detective Ray Morrison appeared at 3:47 p.m., sliding into the chair across from Marcus with the casual ease of someone who had conducted similar meetings in public places many times before. His presence was both surprising and terrifying, given the surveillance reports Marcus had read about the Torrino family's monitoring of honest police officers. "Mr. Chen, you look like someone who's been carrying a heavy burden lately." Marcus studied Morrison's face, searching for signs that this was another trap. Another way the Torrino family was testing his loyalty or gathering information about his intentions. But Morrison's expression carried the weary honesty of someone who had spent years fighting corruption without adequate support. "Detective Morrison, I wasn't expecting to see you here. I've been watching your situation develop since last Thursday, when certain parties began making inquiries about your family. The Torrino organization has been expanding their money laundering operations, and they need legitimate accountants to provide credibility for their financial statements." The casual acknowledgement that Morrison knew about Marcus's predicament suggested surveillance capabilities that matched or exceeded those of the criminal organization. Marcus realized he was caught between two forces, neither of which seemed particularly concerned about his family's welfare. "Are you here to arrest me?" Morrison's laugh carried no humor. "For what? Taking the wrong briefcase on a subway?" The Torrino family is very careful about ensuring their business partners appear to be willing participants rather than coerced accomplices. The detective withdrew a small recording device from his jacket, placing it on the table between them with matter-of-fact precision. The device was smaller than Marcus's thumb, designed to be worn concealed against the body during conversations that needed to be documented for later prosecution. I've been investigating the Torrino family for 3 years, building cases that fall apart when key evidence disappears or witnesses recant their testimony. They've corrupted enough police officers and court officials to make traditional investigations nearly impossible. Marcus stared at the recording device, understanding immediately what Morrison was proposing. You want me to wear a wire? I want you to help me gather evidence that can't be suppressed or discredited. Financial records, recorded conversations, documentation of their operations. That comes from someone with legitimate access to their business activities. The proposal represented exactly the kind of cooperation that Marcus had considered and rejected during his weekend research. Working with law enforcement meant placing his family's safety in the hands of a system that had already proven vulnerable to Torrino influence. Detective, I've seen the files they keep on you. They know where you live, where your family goes to school, where your wife works. How can you protect my family when you can't even protect your own? Morrison's expression darkened with anger that seemed directed at his own limitations rather than Marcus's reasonable concerns. Because eventually someone has to stand up to them. Mr. Chen, if we keep letting them corrupt and intimidate everyone who could make a difference, they become untouchable permanently. The detective opened his wallet and withdrew photographs that made Marcus's blood pressure spike. Images of other families, parents and children who looked like ordinary suburban residents rather than crime victims. Each photograph bore dates and brief notations that told stories of lives destroyed by Torrino family operations. The Williams family. Father was a bank manager who refused to facilitate money laundering through his branch. House fire killed his wife and 2 young sons while he was traveling on business. Officially ruled accidental, though the investigation was suspiciously brief. Morrison showed Marcus the next photograph. The Thompson family. Mother was a federal prosecutor, building a case against Torrino gambling operations. Car accident on her way to work, brake failure that forensic experts somehow couldn't explain adequately. Each image represented the consequences of resistance. Families who had tried to oppose the Torrino organization through legal channels and paid the ultimate price for their courage. Marcus realized that cooperation with law enforcement offered no guarantee of safety, only a different kind of danger. These people tried to do the right thing, Morrison continued. They believed the system would protect them if they followed proper procedures and trusted appropriate authorities. They were wrong. The detective's honesty about law enforcement's limitations was more frightening than reassuring. Marcus had hoped that police protection might provide an alternative to criminal cooperation. But Morrison's presentation suggested that both choices led to potentially fatal consequences. So what's different about my situation? Morrison leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper despite the coffee shop's ambient noise. You have access they've never had before. The Torrino family is bringing you inside their financial operations, trusting you with information that could destroy their entire organization. The recording device lay between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Wearing it would mean documenting conversations that could send Vincent Castellano and his associates to federal prison for life. But it would also mean risking immediate execution if the surveillance was discovered. What about my family's protection during the investigation? Morrison's pause lasted long enough for Marcus to understand that adequate protection wasn't possible. We would do everything within our capabilities. Safe house relocation, federal marshal supervision, witness protection protocols if necessary. The careful language revealed the fundamental weakness in Morrison's proposal. Law enforcement could offer procedures and protocols, but the Torrino family had demonstrated their ability to circumvent official protection through corruption and violence. Marcus picked up the recording device, noting its professional quality and sophisticated design. The FBI had obviously invested significant resources in surveillance technology. But their most advanced equipment couldn't eliminate the human factor that made criminal organizations so dangerous. How long would I need to wear this? Until we gather enough evidence to prosecute successfully. Financial records, recorded admissions, documentation of specific criminal activities. Probably 6 to 8 weeks if you can maintain regular contact with Vincent Castellano. 6 to 8 weeks of living with the knowledge that a single mistake could result in his family's murder. Marcus imagined explaining the situation to Sarah, asking her to trust their safety to a detective who admitted he couldn't guarantee their protection. Morrison stood to leave, allowing Marcus to keep the recording device while he considered the proposal. Mr. Chen, I understand this is an impossible choice, but sometimes impossible choices are the only ones that lead to justice. The detective's departure left Marcus alone with his coffee and the weight of 2 equally dangerous alternatives. Cooperate with the Torrino family and become a permanent criminal, or cooperate with law enforcement and risk immediate retaliation against his wife and daughter. The recording device felt heavier than the Torrino family ring, both objects representing choices that would define the rest of his life and potentially determine whether his family survived. The next 2 months, Marcus spent Tuesday nights staring at the ceiling while Sarah slept fitfully beside him, both of them pretending that normal rest was possible when their 8-year-old daughter's life hung in the balance of decisions neither of them was qualified to make. At 3 a.m., Marcus finally accepted that cooperation. With Detective Morrison represented their only chance of escaping the Torrino family's control without spending the rest of their lives looking over their shoulders. Wednesday morning brought a phone call that made the decision feel both more urgent and more terrifying. Vincent Castellano's voice carried its usual conversational tone, but the underlying message was unmistakably final. Mr. Chen, I trust you've had adequate time to consider our arrangement. Don Salvatore is eager to welcome you formally into our business family. Marcus's hand tightened on the phone as he processed the implications. Don Salvatore Torrino, the family patriarch whose name appeared in federal investigations spanning 3 decades, was personally interested in Marcus's recruitment. The level of attention suggested this was more than routine money laundering expansion. I'm honored by Don Salvatore's interest, Marcus said, using the respectful language he'd learned from his research. I would be pleased to accept your offer. Excellent. Friday evening, we'll have a small celebration to mark the beginning of our partnership. Torrino family traditions include welcoming new associates with appropriate ceremony. The call ended with specific instructions for Friday's meeting. A restaurant downtown, private dining room, formal attire required. Marcus understood that the ceremony would likely involve the Torrino family ring and oaths that would bind him permanently to their organization. That afternoon, Marcus met Detective Morrison in the parking garage beneath the downtown library, a location chosen for its lack of surveillance cameras and minimal foot traffic. Morrison's car, a nondescript sedan that could belong to any government employee, provided the mobile privacy necessary for detailed planning. Wearing a wire to a formal induction ceremony is extremely dangerous, Morrison said, as he demonstrated the recording equipment. The Torrino family will almost certainly check for surveillance devices, especially when bringing someone new into their inner circle. The recording device had been redesigned since their coffee shop meeting, engineered to resemble a common medical device that wouldn't arouse suspicion during casual physical contact. A small transmitter disguised as a hearing aid battery would broadcast to receivers positioned within a 3-block radius of the restaurant. The signal won't penetrate most building materials, Morrison explained, but we'll have surveillance teams close enough to maintain contact and respond immediately if the situation becomes dangerous. Marcus practiced wearing the device while Morrison coached him on conversation. Techniques that would encourage incriminating admissions without seeming obvious. The goal was to record Vincent and other family members discussing specific criminal activities in their own words. evidence that couldn't be dismissed as circumstantial or misinterpreted by defense attorneys. Don't push too hard for information, Morrison warned. These people have decades of experience dealing with informants and undercover investigators. If they suspect you're working with law enforcement, the meeting will end very badly for everyone involved. Morrison opened a briefcase that contained sophisticated recording equipment and a replica of the original briefcase that had started Marcus's involvement with the Torrino family. The duplicate was identical in every detail, from the scratched leather corners to the combination lock mechanism, but it contained hidden cameras and GPS tracking devices instead of criminal evidence. If they ask you to transport money or documents, this case will allow us to monitor their activities without requiring direct surveillance that might compromise your safety. The replica briefcase felt exactly like the original, its weight and balance carefully calibrated to avoid detection through casual handling. Marcus realized the FBI had invested significant resources in his cooperation, suggesting they viewed the Torrino family investigation as a high-priority operation. What happens to my family during the investigation? Morrison's hesitation revealed the limitations that Marcus had feared. We can provide basic protection protocols, regular check-ins, emergency contact procedures, relocation assistance if the situation deteriorates rapidly. But Mr. Chen, I have to be honest about the risks involved. The detective withdrew photographs that showed the surveillance teams who would be monitoring Friday's meeting. Men and women who looked like restaurant staff, business travelers and urban professionals, but whose positions would allow them to observe the private dining room from multiple angles. If something goes wrong during the ceremony, these agents will intervene immediately. But the Torrino family has demonstrated their willingness to use violence against law enforcement, so our response might not be quick enough to prevent retaliation. Marcus studied the photographs, noting the professional appearance of agents who would risk their lives to protect someone they'd never met. The realization that federal law enforcement was prepared to engage in potentially fatal confrontation with the Torrino family made the investigation's importance clear. Morrison handed Marcus a business card that looked completely legitimate, advertising financial consulting services that could explain his presence at business meetings. The card contained emergency contact information disguised as routine business numbers, allowing Marcus to request immediate assistance without revealing his cooperation to potential observers. After Friday's ceremony, you'll begin regular meetings with Vincent Castellano and other family members. Each contact is an opportunity to gather evidence, but it's also an opportunity for them to discover your real purpose. The weight of extended deception settled over Marcus, like fog rolling in from the ocean. Friday's meeting was only the beginning of an investigation that could last months, requiring him to maintain criminal pretenses while documenting activities that could result in life sentences for everyone involved. Detective Morrison, what happens if they never say anything incriminating? What if they're too careful to provide the evidence you need? Morrison's expression suggested he'd considered that possibility during sleepless nights of his own. Then we'll have documented proof of their money laundering operations through your legitimate accounting work, which might be enough for prosecution. But Mr. Chen, organized crime families don't maintain power through caution. Eventually, they'll reveal something that we can use. The replica briefcase sat between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm, representing the technology that would transform Marcus from victim into active participant in a federal investigation that could destroy the most powerful criminal organization in the region. Friday evening was 36 hours away, and Marcus still had to explain to Sarah why their only hope for safety required him to attend a ceremony that could easily become his funeral. Friday evening arrived with a kind of cold rain that made October feel like a preview of winter's harshness. Marcus dressed in his best suit, the FBI recording device taped against his chest, feeling like a bomb that could explode at any moment. Sarah helped him adjust his tie with hands that shook despite her attempts to project confidence for Emma's sake. "Just remember what Detective Morrison taught you," Sarah whispered, as Marcus prepared to leave. "Don't ask direct questions. Let them talk naturally. And get out safely." Emma hugged his legs with 8-year-old enthusiasm, unaware that her father was about to attend a ceremony that could determine whether their family survived the next few hours. "Bring me back dessert, Daddy, the fancy kind from the restaurant." The request broke Marcus's heart with its innocent expectation that he would return home safely with stories about an ordinary business dinner. He promised to try, knowing that dessert would be the least of his concerns if the evening went wrong. La Familia restaurant occupied 3 floors of a converted brownstone in the historic district. Its reputation built on authentic Italian cuisine and the kind of privacy that attracted customers who preferred their business discussions unrecorded. Marcus arrived precisely on time, noting the surveillance team members Morrison had shown him positioned discreetly around the building. Vincent Castellano met him in the lobby, his greeting warm, but his eyes scanning Marcus for signs of nervousness or deception. "Mr. Chen, welcome to our family's favorite restaurant. Don Salvatore is looking forward to meeting you personally." The private dining room on the 3rd floor contained a table set for 8 people, with Vincent's associates already assembled around expensive wine and appetizers that cost more than Marcus's weekly grocery budget. Don Salvatore Torrino occupied the head of the table, his presence commanding despite his advanced age. "Marcus Chen," Don Salvatore's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "Vincent speaks very highly of your professional capabilities and personal discretion." Marcus accepted the introduction with appropriate respect, noting the formal hierarchy that governed every interaction. These men operated according to traditions that had evolved over generations. Rituals that created loyalty through shared participation in ceremony and crime. The dinner proceeded smoothly for 47 minutes. Conversation focusing on legitimate business topics, while Marcus's recording device captured discussions of restaurant operations, real estate investments, and import businesses that sounded almost legal to casual observers. Vincent seemed relaxed, his guard down in the familiar environment surrounded by trusted associates. Then Detective Paulson walked into the private dining room. Marcus recognized him immediately from their meeting in Riverside Park, but Paulson's presence at the Torrino family dinner created confusion that took several seconds to resolve. The corrupt police officer was obviously expected, taking his seat at the table with casual familiarity that suggested regular attendance at such gatherings. "Detective Paulson brings us important information about certain law enforcement activities," Don Salvatore explained, his tone suggesting this was routine rather than exceptional. "Knowledge that helps us maintain appropriate security for our business operations." Paulson consulted a small notebook, his police badge visible beneath his jacket, as a reminder that law enforcement corruption extended to the highest levels of the investigation targeting the Torrino family. "There's been increased FBI surveillance activity around several family business locations. Electronic monitoring, undercover operations, the usual federal overreach." Marcus felt his blood pressure spike as Paulson's briefing continued. The corrupt detective possessed detailed information about ongoing investigations, including surveillance methods and target priorities that could only come from someone with access to classified federal operations. "More concerning," Paulson continued, "there's evidence that federal agents have recruited an informant within the family's business network. Someone with accounting expertise who recently gained access to sensitive financial information." The words hit Marcus like physical blows. Paulson was describing him specifically, outlining details that could only mean the FBI operation had been compromised from the beginning. Detective Morrison's careful planning, the sophisticated recording equipment, the surveillance teams positioned around the restaurant, all of it had been known to the Torrino family in advance. Vincent's demeanor changed instantly, his conversational warmth replaced by the cold calculation of someone preparing to eliminate a threat. "Mr. Chen, perhaps you could explain why you've been meeting with Detective Ray Morrison." Marcus realized that denial was impossible. Paulson obviously possessed surveillance evidence that documented his cooperation with federal law enforcement, probably including photographs from their parking garage meeting and details about the recording equipment he was currently wearing. "Detective Morrison approached me," Marcus said, sticking as closely to the truth as possible. "He knew about my situation with the briefcase and offered protection for my family." Protection. Don Salvatore repeated the word with obvious contempt. Federal protection that requires wearing recording devices to family dinners. Vincent stood and moved behind Marcus's chair, his hands reaching toward the location where the FBI transmitter was hidden beneath Marcus's shirt. "Mr. Chen, I'm afraid we'll need to examine your clothing for any electronic devices that might be broadcasting our private conversation." The recording device felt like it was burning against Marcus's chest as Vincent's hands approached. Once discovered, the transmitter would provide proof of his cooperation with federal law enforcement and justify immediate retaliation against everyone involved. Marcus made a desperate calculation based on Morrison's briefing about emergency procedures. The surveillance teams outside were monitoring radio frequencies for his emergency signal. But the restaurant's heavy construction might block transmission unless he could reach a window or exterior wall. "Vincent, I can explain everything." "I'm sure you can, Mr. Chen, but first, let's ensure our conversation remains appropriately private." Vincent's hands found the recording device with professional efficiency, his experience with surveillance detection obvious as he removed the transmitter and held it up for the table to see. The small device seemed enormous in the restaurant's dim lighting, physical proof of betrayal that eliminated any possibility of explanation or negotiation. Paulson smiled with satisfaction that suggested he'd been looking forward to this moment. "Federal surveillance equipment, just as our intelligence indicated. Mr. Chen has been working with the FBI since Monday, probably since his first contact with Detective Morrison." Marcus noticed blood on his shirt, where Vincent had ripped away the recording device. The small wound, nothing compared to the damage his exposure would cause. The surveillance teams outside would lose contact when his transmitter stopped broadcasting, but their response might be too late to prevent immediate retaliation. Don Salvatore studied the recording device with the interest of someone examining evidence in a trial that had already reached its verdict. "Mr. Chen, betrayal of family trust has consequences that extend beyond individual punishment. Your wife and daughter will need to understand the importance of discretion regarding tonight's unfortunate misunderstanding." The threat to Sarah and Emma transformed Marcus's fear into something approaching rage. These men were prepared to murder his family to maintain their criminal operations, treating child killing as routine business practice rather than unthinkable evil. Marcus pulled his handkerchief from his jacket pocket to press against the bleeding scratch on his chest, the white fabric immediately staining red with blood that seemed to symbolize everything that had gone wrong with Morrison's carefully planned operation. Marcus's escape from La Familia restaurant happened through a combination of desperation and luck that he would never be able to explain rationally. When Vincent stepped away to speak privately with Don Salvatore about disposal arrangements, Marcus broke the dining room window with a wine bottle and jumped 20 feet into the alley behind the building, landing hard on garbage bags that cushioned what should have been a bone-breaking fall. The FBI surveillance teams responded to the sound of breaking glass, but their attempts to coordinate Marcus's extraction were complicated by the same corruption that had compromised the entire operation. By the time federal agents reached the restaurant, the Torrino family members had vanished through exits that suggested intimate knowledge of law enforcement response procedures. Marcus ran through downtown streets in his torn suit. Blood from his chest wound, staining his white shirt, while he tried to reach his car without being intercepted by either criminals or corrupt police officers. The replica briefcase bounced against his leg as he moved, its sophisticated recording equipment now useless evidence of an investigation that had been doomed from the beginning. Detective Morrison's emergency contact number led to a voicemail system that offered no immediate assistance. The backup numbers Morrison had provided went unanswered, leaving Marcus to conclude that federal law enforcement was either compromised or under attack by the same forces that had exposed his cooperation. 23 minutes after escaping from the restaurant, Marcus reached his car and drove toward home through city streets that seemed filled with potential threats. Every police car might contain corrupt officers working for the Torrino family. Every dark sedan might be carrying killers dispatched to eliminate the federal informant who'd threatened their operations. At home, Marcus found Sarah packing suitcases with the efficiency of someone who had spent the week preparing for immediate evacuation. Emma sat on her bed clutching her favorite stuffed animal, her 8-year-old mind processing adult fear without understanding its source. "They called 10 minutes ago," Sarah said as Marcus burst through the front door. "Vincent Castellano. He said we have 6 hours to leave the city or face the consequences of your betrayal." The deadline eliminated any possibility of waiting for federal protection that might never arrive. Marcus realized that Detective Morrison's promises of safety had been built on assumptions about FBI capabilities that didn't account for the extent of Torrino family. Corruption within law enforcement. "Pack only essentials," Marcus said, grabbing documents and cash from the safe hidden behind their bedroom closet. "We need to be gone in 30 minutes. Sarah had already assembled emergency bags containing clothes, medications, and important papers, her preparation revealing conversations they'd had during sleepless nights about escape routes and survival strategies. Emma's bag included school textbooks and art supplies, optimistic provisions for a temporary displacement that all three of them knew might become permanent. Marcus's brother-in-law, Jake, lived in Vermont, 40 miles from the Canadian border, in a cabin that existed off most official records. A former military contractor who specialized in security consulting for executives operating in dangerous regions, Jake possessed skills and resources that made him the only person Marcus trusted to provide meaningful protection. The drive north took them through back roads that avoided major highways where electronic surveillance could track their movements. Marcus used cash for gas purchases and avoided toll roads that would create digital records of their location. Sarah navigated using paper maps rather than GPS systems that could be monitored by law enforcement or criminal organizations. Emma fell asleep in the back seat somewhere near the Massachusetts border. Her trust in her parents' ability to keep her safe, both touching and terrifying. Marcus watched her in the rearview mirror, noting how normal she looked, despite being a refugee from organized crime violence. At 2:47 a.m., they reached Jake's cabin, a structure built for self-sufficiency rather than comfort in the mountains, where cell phone reception was spotty and visitors were rare. Jake met them at the door, armed with a shotgun, his military training evident in the way he assessed threats while welcoming family. "Marcus, you look like someone who's been running from serious trouble." Jake's cabin contained survival supplies for extended isolation, generators, water filtration systems, communication equipment that operated independently of civilian networks. His security consulting work had taught him to prepare for worst-case scenarios that most people couldn't imagine. Marcus explained their situation while Jake prepared coffee and evaluated their options with professional thoroughness. The Torrino family's resources were substantial, but they operated primarily in urban environments where money could buy cooperation from officials and criminals alike. Rural Vermont offered different challenges that might favor desperate families over organized crime. The problem is that running only works if you have somewhere to run to, Jake said after hearing the complete story. These people have connections across multiple states, and they're patient enough to wait months or years for revenge. Opportunities. Jake opened a military surplus case containing identification documents that looked completely legitimate despite being entirely fictional. Driver's licenses, social security cards, birth certificates that could provide new identities for people who needed to disappear permanently. I can get you started with clean documents. But Marcus, you're talking about witness protection without government support. That means giving up everything you've built and starting over somewhere they'll never think to look. The forged documents represented freedom purchased through the loss of everything that had given their lives meaning. New names, new histories, new locations, far from friends and family who would never know what had happened to the Chen family. Sarah examined the identification cards that would transform them from Marcus, Sarah and Emma Chen, into strangers with no connection to their previous lives. What about Emma's education? Her friends? Our parents? Jake's expression suggested he'd seen similar situations before. Families destroyed by criminal violence who faced impossible choices between safety and everything that made life worth living. Mrs. Chen, your daughter's alive, and that's more than a lot of families in your situation can say. The brutal honesty eliminated any illusions about their circumstances. They could accept new identities and spend the rest of their lives looking over their shoulders. Or they could try to return to their normal lives and face assassination by people who viewed murder as routine business practice. Marcus studied the forged driver's license that would make him David Anderson, insurance adjuster from Oregon, an identity that came with complete documentation but no connection to the life he'd spent 34 years building. Outside the cabin, Vermont's mountains provided natural barriers against pursuit, but Marcus understood that geography offered only temporary protection against an organization that had corrupted law enforcement and eliminated witnesses across multiple states. The forged documents waited on Jake's kitchen table like tickets to a life he'd never chosen but might be forced to accept. Jake's security consulting work had brought him into contact with people who specialized in helping individuals disappear from dangerous situations without government assistance. 3 days after arriving at the Vermont cabin, he introduced Marcus to a network that operated in the shadows between legitimate witness protection and criminal underground services. The safe house in rural New Hampshire looked like an abandoned farmhouse from the road, but its interior contained sophisticated communication equipment and sleeping quarters for people who needed to remain invisible while planning their next moves. Marcus, Sarah, and Emma shared the space with 2 other families, fleeing different types of organized crime. Persecution, Maria Santos had testified, against drug dealers who murdered her husband when he refused to transport cocaine through his trucking company. The Federal Witness Protection Program had relocated her family twice, but corrupted law enforcement had revealed their locations both times. Now she lived under her 3rd identity in 5 years, homeschooling her teenage children while working as a house cleaner paid in untraceable cash. The Henderson family had discovered that their son's private school was being used as a recruitment center for human trafficking operations. When they reported their suspicions to local police, they learned that several officers were protecting the criminal network in exchange for substantial payments. Their attempts to contact federal authorities had resulted in death threats that forced them to abandon their lives in suburban Connecticut. Each family's story followed similar patterns. Ordinary people who had encountered criminal organizations too powerful for traditional law enforcement to challenge effectively. Individuals forced to choose between silence and destruction. The safe house provided temporary shelter while they planned permanent relocations to places where their histories couldn't follow them. Carol Chen, the woman who operated the safe house, shared Marcus's surname but no blood relationship. Her organization had evolved from personal experience with government failure to protect witnesses who testified against organized crime families with law enforcement connections. She'd lost her own family to retaliation when federal marshals were corrupted by the same criminals she'd helped prosecute. The official witness protection program works when criminals operate within normal parameters. Carol explained as she briefed Marcus on survival techniques for people living under assumed identities. But when criminal organizations have corrupted the system itself, you need alternatives that operate outside official channels. Carol's office contained a key to a storage facility where documents, cash, and emergency supplies were maintained for people who might need to disappear again on short notice. The key represented security purchased through perpetual vigilance, the constant readiness to abandon any new life that became compromised by persistent enemies. Marcus learned about employment opportunities that didn't require extensive background verification. Construction work paid in cash, house cleaning services that operated informally, farm labor that asked no questions about workers' real names or legal status. The underground economy provided survival income for people whose legitimate careers had become impossible to maintain. Sarah discovered homeschooling networks that helped relocated families educate their children without creating official records that could be traced by determined investigators. Emma would never attend traditional schools again, but she could receive education that prepared her for adult life under whatever identity became necessary for her safety. The most difficult lesson involved severing all contact with their previous lives. No phone calls to relatives, no social media monitoring of friends' activities, no attempts to learn about familiar places or people who might reveal their current locations to anyone conducting systematic searches. The hardest part isn't learning to live under a false identity, Carol explained. It's accepting that everyone you used to know will spend the rest of their lives wondering what happened to you. Your parents will never know if you're alive. Your friends will never understand why you disappeared without explanation. Marcus practiced using his new identity documents, while Sarah learned techniques for altering her appearance in ways that would make recognition difficult for anyone who had known her as a suburban piano teacher. Emma adapted to her new name with 8-year-old resilience, though she occasionally forgot and used her real name during conversations with other children. At the safe house, the storage facility key came with detailed instructions for accessing emergency resources if their situation deteriorated further. Multiple locations across different states, each containing enough cash and documentation to support immediate relocation, created a network of survival options that could keep them ahead of pursuers for years if necessary. After 2 weeks at the safe house, Marcus received contact from an unexpected source. Detective Morrison had survived the exposure of the FBI operation and was working independently to gather evidence against the Torrino family using methods that bypassed corrupted official channels. Morrison's message, delivered through encrypted communication systems that Carol's organization maintained, contained both encouragement and devastating news. The FBI investigation had been suspended pending internal review of security breaches, effectively ending any official attempt to prosecute the Torrino family for their crimes. However, Morrison's message continued, certain evidence gathered during the compromised operation remains valid for prosecution if presented through appropriate channels. Your cooperation is still valuable, though it would require different approaches than originally planned. The proposal meant emerging from hiding to continue gathering evidence against people who had already demonstrated their willingness to kill witnesses and their families. Morrison was asking Marcus to risk everything they'd survived in order to complete an investigation that had already failed once due to law enforcement corruption. Carol advised against any cooperation with officials, regardless of their apparent honesty. Detective Morrison might be completely legitimate, but his communications could be monitored by the same people who corrupted the original investigation. Responding to his contact could reveal your location to the Torrino family. The storage facility key lay on the safe-house kitchen table as Marcus considered Morrison's proposal, its weight representing the choice between permanent hiding and the possibility of justice that might allow his family to reclaim their real names someday. Sarah sat beside him, studying maps of Western states where they could disappear completely into communities that asked no questions about newcomers who paid their bills in cash and kept to themselves. Emma played with other displaced children, her laughter a reminder that some forms of normalcy could survive even in circumstances that destroyed everything else. The key could unlock supplies for another relocation, another identity, another attempt to build lives that had no connection to Marcus, Chen, or the suburban accountant who had accidentally stolen the wrong. A briefcase on a Tuesday evening that now seemed like years ago. Marcus spent 3 sleepless nights weighing Detective Morrison's proposal against the safety his family had found in the underground network. On Thursday morning, he made the decision that would either free them from permanent hiding or destroy what remained of their chances for survival. The encrypted USB drive from the original briefcase had traveled with them through every relocation, its contents representing the most comprehensive evidence of Torrino family operations ever assembled. Marcus had memorized the financial records, but physical proof would be necessary for any prosecution that could dismantle the criminal organization permanently. Carol strongly opposed his plan to cooperate with Morrison, her experience with law enforcement failure evident in every argument she presented. The Torrino family has survived federal investigations for 30 years by corrupting the system from within. An honest detective can't overcome that much institutional compromise, but Marcus had realized something during his weeks in hiding that changed his perspective on their situation. Running would protect his family temporarily, but the Torrino organization would continue destroying other families who encountered their operations accidentally. The Henderson family, the Santos family, countless others who had stumbled into criminal networks too powerful for traditional justice. Someone has to break the cycle, Marcus told Sarah as they discussed his decision in the safe house's tiny bedroom. If everyone runs or stays silent, they become untouchable permanently. Sarah's fear was evident, but her teacher's instincts understood the moral dimension of Marcus's choice. What about Emma? We can't protect her if you're gathering evidence that could get us all killed. Marcus had considered that problem extensively, developing a plan that would minimize risk to his family while maximizing the evidence's impact. Instead of working directly with Detective Morrison, he would document the Torrino family's operations independently and create multiple copies that could be released through different channels if anything happened to him. The digital camera Carol provided looked like standard consumer electronics, but its memory cards could store thousands of photographs with timestamps and location data that would provide irrefutable documentation of criminal activities. Marcus would need access to Torrino family business locations, which meant returning to the world where they were actively hunting him. Jake agreed to provide security consultation, his military experience translating into surveillance techniques that could keep Marcus alive while he gathered photographic evidence. They studied satellite maps of Torrino family properties, identifying observation points that would allow documentation without direct exposure to security personnel. The first target was Vincent Castellano's import business, a warehouse operation that processed legitimate cargo alongside shipments that contained drugs, stolen goods, and money from various illegal enterprises. Financial records from the USB drive indicated specific dates when large cash transfers occurred, providing opportunities to photograph criminal activities. Marcus approached the warehouse district at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, when minimal legitimate traffic would provide cover for surveillance activities. The digital camera's telephoto lens allowed him to document vehicles arriving with New York license plates, men transferring unmarked bags between trucks, counting procedures that involved more cash than any legitimate import business would handle. Each photograph captured details that corroborated the financial evidence Marcus had memorized. License plate numbers that matched the encrypted records, individuals whose faces appeared in FBI files, activities that clearly violated federal import regulations and money laundering statutes. The second location required more dangerous access. Don Salvatore Torrino's restaurant conducted weekly meetings in a private dining room where family business was discussed openly among trusted associates. Marcus needed recordings of those conversations to complement the financial documentation. Jake had acquired professional surveillance equipment during his security consulting career, devices designed for corporate espionage that could record conversations through building materials. The equipment required placement within 50 feet of the target location, which meant infiltrating the restaurant district during business hours. Marcus posed as a telephone repair technician, using credentials that Jake's contacts had provided, along with a service van that looked completely legitimate. The recording device, disguised as routine telecommunications equipment, was installed in a utility box across the street from the restaurant with a clear audio path to the private dining room. 3 weeks of surveillance produced evidence that exceeded even Marcus's expectations. Photographs of cash transfers, recorded conversations about specific criminal activities, documentation of corruption payments to law, enforcement officials whose names appeared in the original USB files. The most damaging evidence came from a conversation between Don Salvatore and a federal judge who was clearly receiving substantial payments in exchange for favorable rulings in cases involving Torrino family members. Marcus's recording captured explicit discussion of case fixing, evidence that could destroy both the criminal organization and its judicial protection. Detective Morrison's secure communication protocols allowed Marcus to preview the evidence before deciding whether prosecution was possible through honest law enforcement channels. Morrison's response revealed both the potential and the continuing dangers of their situation. This evidence could dismantle their entire operation. Morrison wrote, "But presenting it safely requires coordination with federal authorities who are completely isolated from local corruption. The process would require your family to testify openly, which means abandoning any hope of remaining hidden." Marcus realized that justice and safety were mutually exclusive options. They could remain in hiding forever, or they could risk everything to ensure that the Torrino family faced consequences for decades of criminal activity. The digital camera sat on the safehouse table, its memory card containing enough evidence to send dozens of criminals to federal prison for life. But using that evidence would require Marcus and his family to emerge from the underground network that had kept them alive, transforming them from hidden witnesses into public targets for an organization that specialized in eliminating threats to their operations. Sarah studied the camera as if it were a weapon that could either save them or destroy them completely. "If we do this, there's no going back to hiding," Marcus nodded, understanding that the next decision would determine whether their family spent the rest of their lives running from the past or finally confronting it with enough evidence to achieve justice. The Hotel Victorian downtown had been Don Salvatore, Torrino's meeting place for important negotiations since 1987. Its private suites and discreet staff providing the kind of environment where criminal business could be conducted without unwanted surveillance. Marcus chose it deliberately for the confrontation that would either free his family or ensure their destruction. The hotel room key felt heavier than such a small object should, weighted with the finality of decisions that could never be undone. Marcus had booked the suite under his real name, abandoning the false identity that had protected him for 6 weeks. The reservation would appear in credit card records that the Torrino family monitored, ensuring they would know exactly where to find him. Detective Morrison had argued against the direct approach, preferring gradual prosecution through federal channels that would protect Marcus's family while building legal cases methodically. But Marcus understood something that law enforcement seemed to miss. The Torrino organization would never stop hunting them, regardless of how carefully they hid or how completely. They changed their identities. The only solution was negotiation from a position of strength, using the evidence he'd gathered as leverage for permanent safety rather than temporary legal victories that could be overturned through corruption or appealed through sympathetic judges. Sarah and Emma waited at the safe house, their emergency bags packed in case the negotiation failed and immediate evacuation became necessary. Emma had drawn pictures for her father, crayon artwork that showed their family living in a house with a white picket fence where no one was afraid of strangers or unexpected phone calls. Marcus arranged the evidence on the hotel suite's conference table with the precision he'd learned from years of presenting financial information to clients who needed to understand complex situations quickly. Photographs of cash transfers, audio recordings of incriminating conversations, copies of financial documents that detailed decades of money laundering operations. The centerpiece was a comprehensive dossier that connected every piece of evidence into a narrative that federal prosecutors could use to dismantle the Torrino family permanently. Bank account numbers, real estate holdings, business partnerships, corruption payments to officials, documentation of murders disguised as accidents or suicides. Vincent Castellano arrived at precisely 3 p.m., accompanied by 2 associates whose presence suggested that negotiation might quickly become violence if Marcus's proposal wasn't sufficiently compelling. Vincent's expensive suit couldn't disguise the tension in his movements, the wariness of someone walking into a situation he couldn't completely control. "Mr. Chen, you've been very difficult to locate recently. Don Salvatore has been concerned about your welfare." Marcus gestured toward the evidence spread across the conference table, noting how Vincent's expression changed as he recognized the scope of what had been assembled. "Mr. Castellano, I believe we need to discuss new arrangements that serve everyone's interests more effectively." Vincent examined the photographs and documents with professional thoroughness, his years of experience with law enforcement investigations evident in his ability to assess the evidence's potential impact. Each item represented criminal activity that could result in life sentences for family members who had considered themselves protected by corruption and intimidation. "This is impressive work, Mr. Chen. Very thorough documentation of our business operations. However, evidence only becomes dangerous when it reaches appropriate authorities, and we've demonstrated our ability to prevent such unfortunate misunderstandings." Marcus had anticipated Vincent's confidence in the family's protective capabilities. "Mr. Castellano, copies of this evidence have been placed in secure locations with instructions for automatic release if anything happens to my family. Additionally, Detective Morrison and several federal agents have received complete sets of documentation through channels that bypass local law enforcement." The statement was partially false, designed to create uncertainty about the consequences of violence against Marcus or his family. In reality, the evidence existed in only 3 locations, all of which could be compromised if the Torrino family was willing to invest sufficient resources in tracking them down. Vincent's associates moved closer to the conference table, their body language suggesting preparation for immediate action. Marcus realized that his negotiation could end in murder if he failed to convince Vincent that cooperation offered better outcomes than elimination. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Chen?" Marcus had rehearsed this moment for days, understanding that his family's survival depended on presenting terms that served the Torrino family's interests while ensuring permanent safety for witnesses who could destroy their Organization, complete withdrawal from my family's life. No surveillance, no threats, no contact of any kind. In exchange, the evidence remains private and we disappear permanently to locations where we can never pose future threats to your operations. Vincent consulted with his associates in rapid Italian, their conversation intense enough to suggest disagreement about how to respond to Marcus's proposal. Eventually, Vincent returned his attention to the negotiation with an expression that revealed nothing about their decision. Mr. Chen, your terms are reasonable, but they require guarantees that extend beyond simple agreements. Don Salvatore would need assurance that your evidence could never be used against family interests, regardless of future circumstances. The demand meant destroying the evidence completely, eliminating the leverage that made negotiation possible. Marcus understood that Vincent was testing his resolve, determining whether he was prepared to accept genuine powerlessness in exchange for theoretical safety. The evidence represents insurance for my family's protection. Destroying it would eliminate our only guarantee that agreements will be honored permanently. Vincent's smile carried the coldness that Marcus had learned to recognize as a prelude to violence. Mr. Chen, perhaps you misunderstand the nature of our business relationships. We don't negotiate with people who threaten family interests. We eliminate them. The hotel room key lay beside the evidence on the conference table, its presence a reminder that Marcus had chosen this location deliberately. Hotel Victoria's private suites provided security cameras that recorded all activities, creating documentation that would complicate any attempts to murder witnesses within the building. Marcus realized that Vincent's response had revealed the fundamental flaw in his negotiation strategy. The Torrino family viewed any evidence of their crimes as an existential threat that required elimination regardless of cost or risk. Compromise wasn't possible with people who had built their power through absolute control over everyone who encountered their operations. Don Salvatore. Torrino entered the hotel suite at exactly 4:17 p.m., his presence transforming the space from a business meeting into something approaching a tribunal. At 73, he carried himself with the authority of someone who had controlled life and death decisions for half a century. Every movement deliberate and weighted with consequence. Vincent immediately deferred to his patriarch, stepping back from the conference table where Marcus's evidence lay spread like an indictment waiting for judgment. Two additional men flanked Don Salvatore, their positions suggesting bodyguards rather than negotiators, preparation for violence rather than discussion. Marcus Chen. Don Salvatore's voice carried the accent of someone who had learned English as an adult, but spoke it with complete command. You have caused considerable inconvenience to my family's business operations. Marcus forced himself to remain seated as the most powerful crime. Boss in the region studied the evidence that could destroy everything. The Torrino family had built over 3 generations. Photographs of cash transfers, recordings of criminal conversations, financial documents that detailed decades of illegal activity, all arranged with accountant's precision to tell a comprehensive story of organized crime. Don Salvatore examined each item methodically, his expression revealing nothing about the calculations taking place behind eyes that had witnessed more violence than Marcus could imagine. The Torrino family seal, visible on his signet ring as he handled documents, caught the hotel suite's lighting like a reflection of old-world traditions applied to modern criminal enterprise. You understand, Mr. Chen, that this evidence represents information that could harm many people, not just members of my immediate family. Judges, police officers, business partners who have cooperated with our arrangements for years. Innocent people who would suffer if these materials became public. The reference to innocent people struck Marcus as obscene, coming from someone who had ordered murders to protect criminal profits. But he recognized the psychological technique. Don Salvatore's attempt to reframe the moral dimensions of their confrontation, by portraying corruption as collaboration and witnesses as threats to community stability. Don Salvatore, I'm not interested in harming innocent people. I want my family to be safe from retaliation for something we never chose to be involved in. Safety, Don Salvatore repeated the word as if testing its meaning. An interesting concept, Mr. Chen. In my experience, true safety comes from understanding one's place in larger systems, accepting responsibilities that ensure mutual protection for everyone involved. Marcus realized that Don Salvatore was offering him permanent employment within the Torrino organization, a position that would provide security through complicity rather than escape through negotiation. The proposal represented everything Marcus had tried to avoid when he first discovered the wrong briefcase in his kitchen. I'm not interested in joining your organization, Don Salvatore. I want to return to my normal life with my wife and daughter. Don Salvatore's laugh contained no humor, the sound of someone who had heard similar requests from countless people who failed to understand the permanence of their involvement with criminal organizations. Normal life, Mr. Chen. You possessed information that could destroy my family's business interests. That knowledge makes normal life impossible. Regardless of your personal preferences, Vincent consulted his watch, the gesture suggesting that this meeting had a predetermined duration beyond which patience would expire. Marcus understood that Don Salvatore's willingness to negotiate directly represented an unusual honor in criminal hierarchy, one that wouldn't be extended indefinitely. However, Don Salvatore continued, I appreciate your thoroughness in documenting our operations. Such attention to detail suggests professional capabilities that could be valuable in legitimate business contexts. The patriarch withdrew a business card from his jacket, placing it on the conference table beside Marcus's evidence. The card bore the logo of a respected financial consulting firm that Marcus recognized from newspaper business sections, a legitimate company that apparently served as another front for Torrino family money laundering. Partnership, Mr. Chen, senior position, generous compensation, relocation assistance for your family to any city where our business interests require accounting expertise. Your skills applied to legal enterprises that simply require discretion regarding certain client relationships. Marcus examined the business card, noting the prestigious address and references to international financial services that could provide cover for sophisticated money laundering operations. The offer represented everything he'd worked toward professionally, combined with salary levels that would eliminate every financial concern his family had ever faced. And if I refuse? Don Salvatore's expression didn't change, but Vincent stepped closer to the conference table, with movements that suggested preparation for immediate violence. The bodyguards adjusted their positions subtly, creating angles that would allow rapid response to any resistance Marcus might attempt. Mr. Chen, refusal would suggest that you prefer to remain our enemy rather than become our partner. Enemies of my family have historically experienced difficulties maintaining their normal lives. As you've already discovered, the threat was clear without being explicit, delivered with the kind of careful language that had protected Don Salvatore from prosecution for 50 years. Marcus understood that accepting the business partnership would transform him from victim into willing participant, making him complicit in future crimes while eliminating any legal protection his cooperation with law enforcement might have provided. The Torrino family seal on Don Salvatore's ring caught the light again as he reached for one of Marcus's photographs, the ancient symbol representing traditions that had survived immigration, wars, and generations of law enforcement attempts to dismantle organized crime families. Marcus realized he was being offered membership in an organization that viewed itself as legitimate as any corporation, with its own codes of honor and systems of justice that operated independently of American law. I need time to discuss this with my wife, Marcus said. Knowing that delay might be the only option that didn't result in immediate violence, Don Salvatore nodded as if he had expected this response. Of course, family consultation is appropriate for decisions of this magnitude. You have until tomorrow evening to provide your answer, Mr. Chen. After that, circumstances may require more direct resolution of our business relationship. The 24-hour deadline eliminated any possibility of extended deliberation or consultation with Detective Morrison about alternatives that might exist within federal witness protection programs. Marcus would need to choose between criminal partnership and probable death, with no guarantee that either option would actually protect Sarah and Emma from long-term retaliation. The newspaper headlines appeared simultaneously across every major publication in the region at 6 a.m. Thursday morning, their coordinated timing suggesting careful orchestration rather than coincidental journalism. Torrino crime family exposed. Federal investigation reveals decades of corruption dominated the front page of papers that had rarely covered organized crime so prominently. Marcus watched the news coverage from the safe house, his evidence transformed into public documentation that federal prosecutors were already using to justify arrest warrants for 37 individuals, including Don Salvatore Torrino, Vincent Castellano, and 12 law enforcement officers who had accepted corruption payments. Detective Morrison had coordinated the evidence release through channels that bypassed local law enforcement completely, working directly with federal authorities who had been investigating Torrino family operations independently. The comprehensive nature of Marcus's documentation had provided the missing connections that transformed years of suspicious activity into prosecutable criminal conspiracy. The morning news showed federal agents executing search warrants at locations Marcus had photographed. Vincent's import warehouse, the restaurant where family meetings occurred, legitimate businesses that served as money laundering fronts. Each raid produced evidence that corroborated Marcus's recordings and financial documentation. Sarah sat beside him on the safe house couch, holding the newspaper that featured their story prominently. Federal accountant provides evidence that exposes criminal empire ran as a secondary headline, identifying Marcus as the key witness whose cooperation had made the investigation possible. "We can't hide anymore," Sarah said, her voice carrying acceptance rather than fear. "Everyone knows who we are now." The newspaper coverage had eliminated any possibility of remaining anonymous. Marcus's photograph, taken from his Hartwell and Associates employee directory, appeared alongside articles that detailed his accidental discovery of criminal evidence and his months-long cooperation with federal authorities. The Torrino family would know exactly where to direct their retaliation efforts. Detective Morrison arrived at the safe house by 9 a.m., accompanied by federal marshals who would coordinate witness protection arrangements that extended far beyond the informal network that had sheltered Marcus's family during the investigation. Official federal protection meant legitimate new identities, permanent relocation, and security measures that could withstand organized crime retaliation attempts. "The arrests are proceeding smoothly," Morrison reported as he briefed Marcus on the investigation's progress. Don Salvatore was taken into custody at his home without resistance. Vincent Castellano attempted to flee but was apprehended at a private airfield with $2.3 million in cash and false identification documents. The federal marshals explained witness protection procedures that would transform the Chen family's temporary hiding into permanent security, new identities backed by complete documentation, relocation to a region where the Torrino family had no operational presence, ongoing monitoring to ensure their safety remained uncompromised. The prosecution expects to offer plea agreements to lower-level family members in exchange for testimony that corroborates your evidence, Marshal Rodriguez explained. "Your cooperation has provided the foundation for cases that should result in life sentences for the Organization's leadership, Marcus, realized that his accidental involvement in organized crime had evolved into the most comprehensive prosecution of the Torrino family in federal law enforcement history. The evidence he'd gathered during weeks of dangerous surveillance would dismantle criminal operations that had operated with impunity for generations. Emma adapted to the attention with 8-year-old resilience, treating the federal marshals like interesting adults who happened to carry badges and wear serious expressions. She'd drawn pictures of their family's new house, wherever it might be located, complete with a dog she'd been promised once their permanent relocation was complete. The newspaper articles continued throughout the week, each day bringing new revelations about the scope of Torrino family operations and the extent of corruption that had protected them. Judges who had dismissed cases in exchange for payments, police officers who had provided intelligence about investigations, business owners who had laundered money through legitimate enterprises. Detective Morrison became a hero in the coverage, portrayed as an honest investigator who had persisted despite institutional obstacles that had frustrated federal authorities for years. His cooperation with Marcus had provided the breakthrough that made comprehensive prosecution possible. Mr. Chen, your courage in gathering this evidence will protect countless future victims, Morrison said during their final meeting at the safe house. Criminal organizations like the Torrino family depend on intimidation to maintain power. When someone stands up to them successfully, it encourages others to come forward. The Federal Witness Protection Program would relocate Marcus's family to Oregon, where his accounting skills could be applied to legitimate businesses that had no connection to organized crime. Sarah would teach at a public school under her new identity. Emma would grow up in a community where her parents' history wouldn't define her future opportunities. Marcus folded the newspaper and placed it in the box where he was collecting documentation of their experience. Someday, when Emma was old enough to understand, he would explain how an ordinary family had accidentally discovered extraordinary evil and found the courage to expose it despite terrible risks. The headlines that had seemed so frightening that morning now represented vindication rather than exposure. The Torrino family's power had been built on secrecy and corruption, both of which had been destroyed by evidence that transformed criminal secrets into public knowledge. Outside the safe house, federal marshals were preparing vehicles for the family's final relocation, the beginning of lives that would be defined by safety rather than fear. Marcus understood that they would never again be ordinary people living ordinary lives, but they would be free people living authentic lives without constantly looking over their shoulders. The newspaper would yellow with age, but the justice it represented would endure. For as long as the Torrino family members remained in federal prison, serving sentences that ensured they could never again threaten witnesses or corrupt the institutions that were supposed to protect innocent people from organized crime. 6 months after the last headline faded from newspaper archives, David Anderson adjusted his tie in the bathroom mirror of a modest house on Pine Street in Salem, Oregon. The face looking back at him belonged to Marcus Chen, but the man behind, it had learned to answer to a new name with the automatic response that witness protection required for survival. The morning routine felt familiar now. Coffee with his wife Linda, who had once been Sarah Chen, breakfast with their daughter Rachel, who remembered being Emma but had adapted to her new identity with the flexibility that children possess when adults explain that pretending is necessary for safety. David's new driver's license lay on the kitchen counter beside his keys, its Oregon address representing the final transformation from suburban accountant to protected witness living under federal supervision. The laminated card looked completely authentic because it was completely authentic, supported by documentation that would satisfy any investigation except one conducted by people who knew exactly what to look for. Cascade Accounting Services occupied a small office in downtown Salem, its client base consisting of local businesses that generated modest revenue through legitimate activities that required no creative interpretation of tax regulations. David specialized in small retailers and service providers, people whose financial complexity never extended beyond standard business deductions and quarterly estimated payments. The work provided satisfaction that his previous career had never offered. Each client represented honest enterprise, conducted by people who earned their living through skill and effort rather than intimidation and corruption. Mrs. Patterson's flower shop had been replaced by Henderson's Hardware, Rodriguez Construction by Thompson's Landscaping, but the fundamental relationship between accountant and client remained built on trust and competence rather than fear and complicity. Linda taught 4th grade at Maple Elementary School, her piano skills supplementing her regular curriculum in ways that made music education possible despite budget constraints. Rachel thrived in her new school, making friends who knew nothing about crime families or witness protection, children who accepted her completely without understanding the extraordinary circumstances that had brought her family to Oregon. The federal marshals maintained discreet supervision, checking in monthly to ensure that David's family remained secure and undetected by any remnants of Torrino organizations seeking revenge. The monitoring felt protective rather than invasive, professional attention from people who understood that successful witness protection required balancing safety with normalcy. Detective Morrison, now promoted to Lieutenant Morrison, sent occasional updates about the prosecution's progress through secure communication channels that kept David informed without compromising his location. Don Salvatore Torrino had been sentenced to life in federal prison without possibility of parole. Vincent Castellano had received similar sentencing after his attempt to negotiate testimony in exchange for reduced charges failed when prosecutors determined they already possessed sufficient evidence for conviction. 12 police officers had been sentenced to various terms ranging from 5 to 20 years, their corruption exposed in trials that transformed public understanding of how organized crime had infiltrated law enforcement. The cases had prompted federal oversight of several local police departments and implementation of safeguards designed to prevent future compromise of investigations. Rachel's bedroom contained artwork that chronicled her adjustment to their new life, crayon drawings of her Oregon school, her teacher, new friends who invited her to birthday parties and sleepovers that represented normal childhood social development. The trauma of their months in hiding had faded into background memory, overshadowed by present experiences that filled her world with age-appropriate concerns about homework and playground dynamics. David maintained a small box in his home office that contained selected mementos from their previous life. The family photograph that had sat on his desk at Hartwell and Associates, Emma's drawing of their Connecticut house, newspaper clippings from the Torrino family trials. These items served as reminders of how dramatically their circumstances had changed and how much they had sacrificed to achieve justice. On quiet evenings when Rachel was asleep and household routines were complete, David and Linda would discuss their extraordinary journey from suburban normalcy to federal witness protection. The conversations helped them process experiences that few people could understand, the psychological weight of decisions that had saved their lives while ending their previous identities. "Do you ever regret it?" Linda asked one evening, as they watched Oregon's sunset paint their backyard in colors that reminded them both of Connecticut autumns. David considered the question while observing Rachel's bicycle in their garage, her soccer cleats by the back door, evidence of a childhood that continued despite everything they had survived. "I regret that it was necessary, but I don't regret that we did it." The driver's license represented more than new identity documents. It symbolized the possibility of authentic life after surviving circumstances that destroyed many families. The opportunity to build futures based on choices rather than fears. David Anderson might be a fiction created by federal authorities, but the man who wore that name was real, complete with genuine relationships and meaningful work and hopes for his family's continued happiness. Rachel called from her bedroom, requesting a bedtime story about Princess Rachel, who solved problems through intelligence and courage rather than magic. David climbed the stairs to continue the tradition he'd maintained through every identity change, every relocation, every transformation that had carried them from danger into safety. Outside their Oregon home, no black sedans waited under streetlights. No strangers photographed their daughter during school recess. No threatening phone calls interrupted dinner conversations about homework and weekend plans. The new driver's license would need renewal in 4 years, a routine administrative task that represented the kind of normal future they had earned through surviving extraordinary circumstances that began with a simple mistake on a subway platform that now seemed like someone else's story from another lifetime.